Hello, today we will be doing our presentation on the regeneration after destruction, secondary succession in Point Pleasant Park, after Hurricane Juan. We would like to recognize that Dalhousie is located on Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of Mi'kmaq. We are all treaty people. We recognize that African Nova Scotians are distinct people whose histories and legacies and contributions have enriched Nova Scotia for over 400 years. In this presentation, we will be looking at the ecology and succession of Point Pleasant Park over the last 20 years. We would like to recognize that Point Pleasant Park was originally an important Mi'kmaq gathering place called Emitukati, which means spiritual place or the place of the spirits. Point Pleasant Park is an urban park within an evergreen forest, mostly made up of softwood trees, red spruce being the most dominant species. This study started in 2004 as a way to measure secondary succession after the devastation of Hurricane Juan, a Category 2 hurricane which hit Nova Scotia on September 29, 2003. Succession describes the gradual and continuous change in species composition and community structure over time. Secondary succession happens when an ecological community is impacted by a disturbance. In this case, the disturbance is Hurricane Juan. Within this presentation, we will look at different factors to determine how the community has changed over this time period. These factors include species richness, which is the number of species found within a region of interest, total density or abundance, which are interchangeable terms that mean the number of individuals in a given species, and lastly, species evenness, which is the distribution of abundance of different species within a community. The objectives for this presentation are to see how the forest community has changed over time, how the density of the dominant species in 2004 and 2023 changed over time, and how species richness and evenness has changed over time. Our null hypothesis for the following questions are that the overall community has not changed over time, the density of the dominant species in 2004 and 2023 has not changed over time, and that the species richness and evenness within the community has not changed over time.
For this research, data was collected from a 400-meter study site at the south end of Point Pleasant Park, Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, from 2004 to 2024, which is a period of 20 years. All trees with a diameter at breast height greater than 2.5 centimeters at the study site were measured and their species were identified and recorded. This data was used to determine the density of two dominant species, red maple and red spruce, in the study site. And then in addition to this, 12 1-meter squared quadrants were placed semi-randomly throughout the study site. Their locations were determined by throwing a brightly colored object over the shoulder and centering the quadrant on the place where it landed. After the first quadrant was placed, the location of the second quadrant was determined by throwing the object again from the first location, and so forth. Every species of plant within each quadrant was identified, and their respective percent covers were roughly estimated. The species and percent cover data taken from the quadrats was used to calculate richness, Shannon diversity index, and Peelu's evenness values for the study site. After that, linear regression analyses were performed on each data set. For reference, overall density, red spruce density, red maple density, diameter at breast height, richness, Shannon diversity index, and Peelu's evenness. We chose to use linear regression because, as this research is interested in succession following disturbance, and that is a process that takes place over time, in this case many years, we wanted to see how much the change in each of these variables since Hurricane Juan could be explained by time elapsed. Thank you.
We used a linear regression analysis to examine the effect of time on forest density in Point Pleasant Park. As shown in Figure 1, this scatter plot shows the total forest density in an area of 400 meters squared, which was shown to increase over time between year and density. It's described by the equation density is equal to 8.7215 multiplied by the year, subtract 17,489. This trend suggests an ongoing secondary successional process with increasing density reflecting recovery from Hurricane Juan and movement towards a climax community. So the F statistic, 81.6, indicates a strong relationship between year and forest density, which means that the model is statistically significant and provides a good fit for the data. The R squared value of 0.492 means that approximately 49% of the variance in forest density can be explained by the year. The remaining 51%, however, is attributed to other factors that aren't included in our model. Additionally, since the p-value is much lower than the common threshold, we can reject our null hypothesis, which means that there is a statistically significant relationship between time, year, and forest density in Point Pleasant Park, reinforcing the validity of our regression model. Now, undoubtedly, the Point Pleasant Park forest community has changed over time. Let's look at why these changes have occurred and what we can predict about the forest's future as we move towards a climax community. So, following Hurricane Juan in 2003, we know that Point Pleasant Park experienced severe canopy loss, with more than 70% of their forest canopies having been destroyed. Now, this disturbance, the hurricane, and resulting canopy loss created more light availability and reduced the competition for space, allowing early successional species to quickly reestablish within the forest community. What can we predict will happen to the overall community as the forest moves towards its climax community? Well, with the continued regrowth of the forest community and the reestablishment of early successional species and the canopy, we predict environmental factors like excess light will change and be reduced, allowing for the growth of late successional species, which are shade tolerant and slow to grow. We also predict that if undisturbed by additional disasters or destructions, including hurricanes like Juan, the Point Pleasant Park forest community will transition into a climax community forming mature Acadian forests. This is due to the fact that secondary succession occurs following disturbances where ecosystems move through successional stages from early light-dependent species to shade-tolerant climax species. And overall, our results show that as the forest recovers over time and the density of vegetation has steadily increased since Hurricane Juan, which has been observed in other studies showcasing the secondary successional pattern. Thanks.
Red maple and red pine are the current two dominant species in Point Pleasant Park at the study site we examined, and so we used regression analysis to examine variation in red spruce density over time at the study site following the disturbance caused by Hurricane Juan, and we found a statistically significant positive R squared equals 0, 0.1128 and so on relationship between the two variables, showing that as time passes, the density of red spruce does increase. And then we again used regression analysis to examine variation in red maple density over time at the study site. And we found a statistically significant positive relationship, R squared equals 0.1549 between the two variables. So we see again that as time passes, the density of red maple increases. Although do note these are small R square increases. They only explain around 10 to 15% of the total variation in density. So keep that in mind. So, according to Nieli et al., 2011, red spruce is a climax species, which indicates that we can expect it to remain well represented in the community into the future. Turchin, 2016, proposed that the current status of red maple as a dominant species is in large part due to its relatively short lifespan of around 150 years, and its resulting quick growth rate, which allows it to establish itself rapidly compared to other large tree species, which often grow slower. And this pattern will be consistent with Nieli et al.'s findings, which characterize a community co-dominated by red spruce and red maple as being a mid-successional vegetation type seen in Acadian forests, such as Point Pleasant Park, following a disturbance such as that caused by significant uprooting due to wind, exactly like what we saw happen with Hurricane Juan. And then Nieli et al. Predict that this community is likely to be succeeded by one dominated by red spruce and hemlock, red spruce and yellow birch, or hemlock and yellow birch. Due to the current establishment of red spruce as a co-dominant species and its long lifespan of around 450 years, according to Turchin 2016, we postulate that the succeeding climax community will likely retain it as a dominant member.
The species richness in Point Pleasant Park has changed greatly over the years. Species richness is the measure of the number of different species found within a community. The species richness has increased significantly over the 20 years of research. We used a regression analysis to obtain an R-squared value of 0.6 with a p-value of 2.2 times 10 to the negative 16. This p-value indicates a significant relationship between species richness and years since Hurricane Juan. This means that the species richness has been, on average, increasing over the years. I predict that the species richness will eventually plateau due to factors such as resource limitation. The second metric is Pylo's evenness, which measures how evenly the number of individuals is distributed between the species. We used a regression analysis to determine that Pylo's evenness had a R-squared value of 0.04 and a p-value of 0.07, indicating that the relationship of evenness over the years is not significant. This makes sense as evenness of communities tends to decrease as the community becomes more complex due to many factors such as competition. I predict that the evenness will continue to slightly decrease as a result of factors such as resource partitioning.
Alright, so for our conclusions, based on the trends in the data and the successional theory, we can conclude that Point Pleasant Park is currently in a mid-succession stage. Now, in this stage, we often see a mix of pioneer species, which are plants that are the first to recolonize disturbed areas, and some later succession species which take root as conditions stabilize and as time progresses. Now, this aligns with research from, I'm probably butchering his name, but Hotkem et al. In 1985 on post-hurricane observations, where faster-growing resilient species were noted, but signs of gradual succession toward a mature forest became evident as time progressed. Now, since Point Pleasant Park is an urban park, there are other factors that impact its successional process in general, including anthropogenic disturbances and the effects of fragmentation. Now, anthropogenic disturbances refer to human activities like trampling the environment, creating recreational pathways, and causing disturbances from pet traffic. And as we all know, these things are almost always a constant at Point Pleasant Park, as it's in Halifax's urban center. And these activities actually compact the soil, which disrupt the root systems and impact the composition of the species as it favors more resilient and early successional species over those of later stages. Fragmentation, however, refers to the ecological impact that's brought about when large habitats like wide open forests are fragmented into smaller patches as a result of our urban development. Now, continuous forest landscapes are different in the sense that Point Pleasant Park is bordered by urban development since it's in downtown Halifax, which increases the proportion of edge habitats separated by buildings, roads, etc., that cause this certain habitat, the edge habitat, to be exposed to more sunlight, wind, and temperature fluctuations, all of which make them more vulnerable to invasive species and making it unsuitable for shade-tolerant or sensitive plants that are typically found in the forest interior. Now, it's important to note that Point Pleasant Park was traditionally a significant Mi'kmaq gathering place known as Amdu Gadi, meaning spiritual place or place of the spirits. So, using this information, in addition to the current Western scientific methodologies we use to investigate, understand, and support the science of succession and other ecological processes, it's important to know that we can incorporate, and we should incorporate, traditional knowledge and values from Indigenous people, and one of those being the two-eyed seeing concept, which was created by the Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall. And I think this would be valuable in supporting the recovery of Point Pleasant Park to a mature, vibrant, and dynamic Acadian forest. And a few ways we could put this into practice are by combining these scientific approaches like planting and just managing the growth of different species with Mi'kmaq ecological knowledge that prioritizes minimal intervention, respect for the land, and sustainable practices. Another way we could do this is by incorporating areas that aren't interfered with by the public so that the forest can regenerate without any human influence. And this would sort of draw on principles of Mi'kmaq stewardship. Now, in conclusion, understanding Point Pleasant Park's current successional stage as a mid-succession forest and acknowledging the influence of urban factors like fragmentation and anthropogenic disturbances, this highlights the challenge and opportunity for restoring the forest with two-eyed seeing in support of the resilient, biodiverse, mature Acadian forest that Point Pleasant Park will be as succession progresses. We would like to thank Dr. Allison Schmidt and Jennifer Amson for their invaluable advice and support in the making of this presentation, and we would also like to acknowledge that Dalhousie University, Point Pleasant Park, and Halifax are situated in Kijapuktuk, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are all treaty people, and we also recognize that African Nova Scotians are a distinct people whose histories, legacies, and contributions have enriched Nova Scotia for over 400 years. Thank you.